The Dakota Territory stretched endlessly under the merciless August sun of 1881, its golden grasslands shimmering like molten copper in the brutal heat. Near Shadow Lake, where mercury-tainted waters reflected the skeletal remains of abandoned mining claims, the afternoon wind carried more than the usual scent of sage and buffalo grass. It carried the high, desperate screams of children facing death. Tokala pressed his weathered chest against the sun-baked earth, feeling vibrations through his ribs that spoke of running predators and prey in mortal terror. 25 summers had carved deep lines around his dark eyes, and the jagged white scar across his left cheek told stories of battles fought in the Black Hills when the Wasakyu, the white men, first came seeking gold. But it was the smaller invisible scars that hurt most the memories of two younger sisters whose laughter had been silenced by cavalry sabers 5 winters past while he hunted elk too far from camp to save them. Those screams, now 3 distinct voices, young and female, cut through his soul like heated knives. His painted pony, a sturdy mare, marked with traditional lightning bolts across her flanks, nickered softly behind him, sensing the same mortal danger that had drawn her rider to this desolate place. Tokala had been tracking a wounded elk when the sounds reached him, but the elk was forgotten now. In his 25 years, he had learned to distinguish between different kinds of human cries, and these were the sounds of children about to die. He belly-crawled forward through the tall prairie grass until the shallow draw came into view below. What he saw there made his warrior's blood turn to ice. A small settler wagon sat canted at an impossible angle, its rear wheels buried hub-deep in treacherous black mud, hidden beneath innocent-looking grass. The draft pony lay on its side, ribs heaving in agony, its left foreleg bent at an angle that spoke of shattered bones and certain death. The animal's brown eyes rolled with pain, but it made no sound, as if understanding that silence might mean survival for the children it had tried to protect. Surrounding the helpless wagon like gray phantoms given flesh and hunger, 6 timber wolves paced in a tightening circle. Their yellow eyes gleamed with the patient cunning of predators who knew their prey had nowhere to run. Recent drought had driven the pack far from their usual hunting grounds, while constant blasting from Dietrich Thorn's mercury mines had scattered the deer and rabbits they would normally pursue. These wolves were desperate, and desperate predators feared nothing, not even the strange scent of human gunpowder. In the wagon bed, 3 settler girls huddled together. The eldest appeared perhaps 16, with fair hair falling loose from what had been a neat braid and intelligent blue eyes that darted constantly between the circling death. She clutched an old rifle that seemed too heavy for her slender arms. The middle child, maybe 13, gripped a broken wagon, spoke like a club, her knuckles white with determination. The youngest, no more than 11, pressed against her sisters with tears streaming down dirt-stained cheeks, her small body shaking with exhaustion and terror. The alpha wolf, a massive beast with battle scars crisscrossing his gray coat, paced closer to the wagon's edge. His ribs showed through matted fur, testament to weeks of unsuccessful hunting. Tokala counted the pack with a tracker's practiced eye, 6 adults, all lean with terrible hunger. The alpha would attack first, drawing attention, while the others flanked. He had seen this tactic destroy buffalo calves, and it was devastatingly effective. The eldest girl raised her rifle with hands that trembled despite obvious efforts at control. "Stay back," she shouted, her voice cracking. "I'll shoot." The alpha's lips pulled back in a silent snarl that revealed yellowed fangs, its powerful hindquarters bunched beneath its coat muscles, coiling as it prepared to launch itself at the wooden sides of their pitiful fortress. Tokala moved without conscious thought. Years of warrior training took over, where deliberation would have meant death for the children below. The Spencer carbine bucked against his shoulder, its sharp report echoing across the prairie like thunder. The bullet kicked up dust between the alpha and wagon, close enough that the beast felt the heat of its passage. The pack scattered, but only momentarily. They had grown accustomed to distant gunfire from mining camps, and this shot, while closer, wasn't close enough to maintain their instinctive fear. Within seconds, they were circling again, and their patience now edged with more dangerous desperation. Fire. It was the one thing that could drive them back permanently, the ancient enemy that haunted their kind, from 10,000 generations of ancestors who had fled before human torches. Rolling to his knees, Tokala pulled a twisted bundle of sage from his belt and struck flint to steel. The dry prairie grass caught immediately, sending up sweet-scented smoke that carried memories of sacred ceremonies. He waved the burning bundle overhead until sparks scattered on the wind like fallen stars. The wolves' ears flattened against their skulls, but the alpha was too hungry to retreat completely. It circled wider, those terrible yellow eyes fixed on the youngest girl whose sobs carried across the wind. Tokala saw the exact moment when the beast made its final decision, saw the subtle shift in posture that preceded the killing leap. The wolf launched itself at the wagon's side with fluid power. Tokala threw the burning sage and sprinted forward, drawing his bone-handled knife as he ran. The sacred blade had been his grandfather's, blessed by medicine men, and sharpened on stones from the Black Hills. It caught sunlight as he raised it, ready to meet tooth and claw with steel and determination, ready to protect these children as he had failed to protect his own sisters. The alpha hit the wagon bed with a crash of splintering wood. Its massive jaws snapped inches from the youngest girl's terrified face, close enough that she could smell the carrion scent of its last meal. But the eldest sister surprised everyone. Instead of screaming, she thrust the broken wagon spoke forward with both hands, driving its jagged end into the wolf's exposed ribs. The beast howled in pain and fury, dark blood matting its gray fur as it twisted away from the unexpected counterattack. Tokala reached them as a second wolf leaped for the opposite side. He intercepted the animal in midair, his knife finding the space between ribs with the precision that came from a lifetime of hunting. The blade went deep, finding the heart, and the wolf collapsed in a heap of twitching limbs. The rest of the pack retreated to safer distance, pacing and whimpering as they reassessed this suddenly dangerous situation. The alpha, wounded but far from mortally hurt, bared its fangs one final time before leading its followers into the gathering dusk. They would return. Wolves were patient hunters, but not tonight. Tokala stood breathing hard, his knife still dripping crimson, and turned to examine the three girls who stared at him, with expressions ranging from shock to gratitude. The youngest bore a thin line of blood on her right forearm, where the alpha's teeth had grazed skin not deep, but enough to require attention in this land, where infection killed as surely as fang or bullet. "You're hurt," he said in carefully practiced English, his accent thick but words clear. Years of trading with settlers had given him facility with their language, though he still thought in Lakota. He tore a strip from his shirt. "Hold still, little one." The girl, barely more than a child, extended her injured arm without hesitation. As he wrapped the makeshift bandage with gentle hands that seemed too large and scarred for such delicate work, she whispered, "Thank you, mister." The words settled somewhere deep in Tokala's chest, in the hollow place where his sisters' voices used to echo. The eldest sister climbed down from the wagon with careful dignity, still clutching the bloodied wagon's spoke. Despite obvious exhaustion written across her features, she carried herself with rigid composure that spoke of someone forced to grow up too quickly. "I'm Lillian Hargrove," she said, her voice steady now that immediate danger had passed. "These are my sisters Beatrice and Nora." Tokala tied off the bandage and stood studying the three faces before him. They were clearly sisters, the same fair coloring, the same determined set to their chins, the same intelligent eyes that missed nothing despite obvious fatigue. But there was something else in their expressions, a wariness that spoke of recent loss and hard-won knowledge about the world's cruelty. "I am Tokala," he replied simply. "Why do you travel alone across dangerous country? This is not safe for children without protection." Lillian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Our parents are dead. We're traveling to our uncle in Willow Springs. He's the only family we have left." The words were matter of fact, but Tokala heard careful control behind them. These children had learned to speak of tragedy without breaking down, which meant they had been carrying this burden for some time. "The wagon will not move," he said, testing the black mud with his moccasin. The stuff was like tar, thick and clinging. "Your pony is badly injured. Night comes soon and the pack will return with darkness." As if summoned by his words, the first stars appeared overhead. Somewhere in the growing gloom, a wolf howled, distant now, but the sound carried a promise. "But we walk," Dakota decided. "Follow the river lights toward town. Stay close, move quiet, and do not fall behind." As they began their long trek across the darkening prairie, none of them realized that Lillian's canvas bag contained something far more valuable than gold and infinitely more dangerous to certain powerful men. Hidden among her few possessions were documents that would determine whether justice or corruption ruled the Dakota territory. The real battle was about to begin. By dawn, they had reached the banks of Willow Creek, where the wagon road curved toward distant Willow Springs. Dakota's painted pony bore 3 parallel scratches across her left flank, souvenirs from the wolf fight that weren't deep enough to cripple, but served as vivid reminders of how close they had all come to death. The morning light revealed more about the 3 sisters. Lillian carried herself with careful composure, her blonde hair pinned back in a style that suggested both practicality and pride. Her dress, while clearly well-made, originally showed patches and mending that spoke of months spent making do with little. Most telling was how her eyes constantly swept their surroundings, as if she had learned never to trust that safety would last. Beatrice moved with quick, nervous energy, her hands never still, always reaching to help adjust Nora's bandage, or to retrieve something from their bags, or to smooth her brown hair back into place. She had the look of someone who found comfort in constant motion. Little Nora stayed close to her sisters with wide-eyed wariness. The wolf bite was healing cleanly, but she favored it when she moved and kept glancing back over her shoulder as if expecting yellow eyes in the grass. "Your uncle will be worried about your delay," Dakota observed, checking his pony's wounds. Lillian's expression darkened. "Uncle Roland doesn't know we're coming. We couldn't send word ahead." Before Dakota could ask for clarification, the sound of wagon wheels reached them from the eastern road. 3 freight haulers approached their heavily loaded wagons drawn by teams that showed the strain of hauling mining equipment across rough country. The lead driver, a nervous man with greasy hair and tobacco stains on his vest, pulled up his horses and studied them with suspicious eyes. "You folks heading into Willow Springs?" "We are," Lillian replied carefully. The driver spat brown tobacco juice into the dust. "Name's Pete Kowalski. These here are Quiet Will Morrison and Peg-Leg Dan Murphy." He gestured toward his companions, one silent and bearded the other, missing his left leg below the knee. "You might want to reconsider." Pete continued, his hands fidgeting with the reins. "Town's got considerable excitement just now. Mr. Thorne's security men are hunting 3 young ladies and an Indian scout. Description matches you folks pretty closely." Dakota's hand moved toward his knife. What business would Mr. Thorne have with children? Pete's anxiety increased. "Word is, Sheriff Mathers got custody papers for some orphaned girls, all legal and proper. And there's talk about stolen property belonging to the mining company." Lillian stepped forward. "What right does Mr. Thorne have in sheriff's business?" "Well now, miss, that's complicated." Pete leaned forward conspiratorially. "See, Mr. Thorne pretty much owns everything around Shadow Lake Mines, equipment workers' housing, even the store. And Sheriff Mathers, well, his campaign fund's been mighty healthy these past years." The implications hung in the air like smoke. After the freight wagons rumbled away toward Shadow Lake, Dakota studied the sisters with renewed interest. "Tell me about your parents," he said directly. Lillian exchanged glances with Beatrice before answering. "Father worked as chief bookkeeper for Dietrich Thorne at the Shadow Lake Mercury mine. Mother died of fever this past spring, just 3 months after father was killed in what they called a mining accident." "What manner of accident?" Tokala asked, though her tone suggested the answer wouldn't be simple. The kind that happens when a man asks too many questions about payroll discrepancies. Beatrice said bitterly. Tokala could see the fear in their eyes now, the way they held themselves like small animals who had caught scent of a stalking predator. Your uncle is Sheriff Roland Mathers. Our mother's younger brother, Lillian confirmed. According to Father's will, he's our legal guardian. Tokala considered this. Roland Mathers had a reputation even among the Lakota, a man whose badge served gold rather than justice. If these girls were fleeing from Thorne's men, Mathers might not prove to be the sanctuary they hoped for. There is someone in Willow Springs who might help, Tokala said carefully. A physician named Dr. Edwin Carter. He treated my people during the spotted sickness last winter. Why would you help us? Lillian asked directly. Tokala was quiet for a long moment. Last winter, when our children were dying, Dr. Carter could have turned away. He chose differently. He came to our camp every day for 3 weeks, bringing medicine and sharing knowledge. He met her searching gaze. Among my people, debts of life and death are not forgotten. It was truth, but not complete truth. Something about these 3 sisters, their courage against the wolves, how they protected each other, the quiet dignity with which they bore their losses, reminded him powerfully of his own younger sisters killed in a cavalry raid 5 summers past when he had been away hunting, unable to protect them. The guilt still haunted his dreams. By mid-morning, they reached Willow Springs. The town squatted beside the winding river, its dusty streets radiating from a central square dominated by courthouse and church. But there were ominous signs, 6 horses tied outside the sheriff's office men, with rifles lounging in whatever shade they could find. These were hired guns, the kind who asked no questions as long as pay arrived on time. Dr. Carter's clinic is on River Street, Tokala said quietly. They made it 3 blocks before trouble found them. You there, hold up? The voice cracked like a whip across the dusty street. 6 men stepped from building shadows, led by a lean figure with predatory grace. He had the kind of face that belonged on wanted posters, sharp features, cold gray eyes, and pallor that came from too much time in saloons. Henry Alton. He introduced himself with mock politeness, touching his hat brim. Most folks call me Hawkeye. He wore a deputy's badge, but the gun on his hip cost more than most men earned in a year. These young ladies need to come with us. Hawkeye continued producing a folded document. Official county business. By what authority? Lillian demanded. Hawkeye unfolded the paper theatrically. Custody order from Judge Harrison's court. Miss Lillian, Miss Beatrice, and Miss Nora Hargrove are hereby declared wards of Dakota Territory under Sheriff Mathers' protection. The legal language sounded official, but Tokala noticed details suggesting questionable authenticity paper, too clean for something from the territorial capital ink, too fresh. And Hawkeye's eyes never quite meeting anyone's gaze while reading. The girls are injured and require medical attention, Tokala said firmly. They'll get attention at the county facility. Hawkeye replied, his hand drifting toward his gun. Step aside, Redskin. That was when little Nora made a small, frightened whimper, and Hawkeye made the crucial mistake of reaching for her bandaged arm with rough hands. Tokala's response was instantaneous. His palm struck Hawkeye's wrist with enough force to numb fingers and send pain shooting to the shoulder. Do not touch the child. The other men tensed hands, moving toward weapons, but Hawkeye held up his uninjured hand. Easy, boys. No gunplay in the street. His gray eyes fixed on Tokala with flat predator stare. Yet, Dr. Carter's clinic, Tokala repeated. 5 minutes. Hawkeye flexed his fingers, testing for damage. 5 minutes, then they come with us. But 5 minutes was all they needed to discover how deep corruption in Willow Springs had spread. Dr. Edwin Carter was a slight man in his mid-40s with graying hair and gentle hands that came from years of healing rather than hurting. When Tokala ushered the girls through his clinic door, Carter immediately turned the heavy lock. Sheriff's business doc Hawkeye called from outside. Carter ignored the shouted demands, focusing on unwrapping Nora's bandage and examining the wolf bite with professional thoroughness. As he cleaned the wound with carbolic acid, he spoke quietly to Lillian. "Your father was a good man, child. He came to me 3 times during his final weeks, trying to document what Thorne was doing." Carter's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Samuel suspected the payroll irregularities were just the beginning. Lillian's face went pale. "Did he tell you what he'd discovered?" "Some of it. Workers reporting full weeks, but receiving pay for only half. Minors assigned to claims that didn't officially exist. Water rights being transferred without owner's knowledge." Carter's expression grew grim. "Your father believed Thorne was using mining operations as cover for extensive land acquisition. What about Uncle Roland?" Beatrice asked. Carter paused in his stitching his silence, more eloquent than words. Finally, he shook his head. "Roland Mathers won't help you. Thorne's been funding his campaigns for 2 years. The implications hit all 3 sisters simultaneously. They were truly alone. There is someone who might help." Carter continued applying a proper bandage. "Your father's older sister, Miss Abigail Hargrove. She teaches at the school and has been asking questions about Thorne's operations." Outside, the sound of breaking glass punctuated Hawkeye's growing impatience. Through the window, they could see one of his men holding a lit match near the building's wooden shutters. Fire spreads mighty fast in dry summer. Hawkeye's voice carried through the walls. Carter continued writing an urgent message. "Back door. When full darkness falls, we move." As afternoon faded toward evening, Tokala wondered what secrets these 3 brave girls carried that were worth burning down a doctor's office to obtain. The back alley behind Dr. Carter's clinic pressed close on both sides, like walls of a narrow canyon. Full darkness had brought no relief from the oppressive heat, but it offered precious shadows, their only hope of escaping the trap Willow Springs had become. Carter extinguished the clinic's oil lamps one by one, leaving only a single candle in the back room where Nora dozed fitfully against Lillian's shoulder. The youngest sister's fever had returned, despite careful treatment, and she shivered periodically, even in the stifling heat. Abigail's homestead lies 2 miles north. Carter whispered, checking his pocket watch by candlelight. "If we can reach the river without being spotted, we can follow it most of the way." Tokala peered through the back window at the narrow space between buildings. 2 men watched the front one at the corner. Where would they place the 4th? Jensen's livery stable. Lillian said thoughtfully. "They'd want to control the horses." Carter nodded approvingly. "Your father raised you to think clearly under pressure." He gathered essential medical supplies. "We leave in 5 minutes." But as they prepared to slip into the dangerous night, heavy boots thundered on the front steps. Someone pounded on the clinic door with authority that expected immediate compliance. "Dr. Carter, this is Sheriff Mathers, open immediately." The voice was deeper and more commanding than Hawkeye's carrying weight of official authority. Through the front window, they glimpsed a tall figure in a white hat, silver badge catching moonlight. "Uncle Roland." Lillian breathed her face, showing complex mixture of hope and fear. Another round of pounding, more insistent. "I know they're in there, Carter." Carter looked at Tokala with desperate eyes. The back door remained their only escape, but they had to move immediately. Tokala scooped sleeping Nora into his arms, surprised by how light she felt, too light for a girl her age. "We go now." They slipped out like ghosts, Carter leading while Tokala brought up the rear. Behind them, splintering wood announced that Mathers had lost patience. The alley seemed endless in darkness, walls pressing close enough to touch. They had covered perhaps 50 yards when a shadow detached from a doorway ahead, a heavy-set man with massive arms and a rifle held with casual competence. "Well, well," the man said conversationally. "Look what we have wandering after dark." Behind them, Angry shouts erupted from the clinic as Mathers discovered their absence. Lantern light began moving through the building, and it would be moments before someone checked the back alley. Nowhere to run now. The gunman continued grinning with predator confidence. That was when Beatrice Hargrove proved courage ran in her family bloodline. The 13-year-old had been clutching her carpet bag throughout their ordeal, holding it like a lifeline. Now she swung that bag with both hands, and every ounce of strength, catching the surprised gunman square in the face. The bag proved considerably heavier than its appearance suggested, weighted with precious belongings, including several books and a cast-iron jewelry box that had belonged to their mother. The impact sent the man staggering backward, his rifle discharging harmlessly into the air with a boom that echoed off alley walls. "This way," Carter hissed, grabbing Beatrice's arm. But Hawkeye's men were converging from all directions, drawn by the gunshot. As they ran through the maze of back streets, they could hear boots pounding on wooden sidewalks, voices shouting orders, the creak of leather as mounted men spurred horses into pursuit. They reached the riverbank to find their path blocked by steep embankment and fast-moving water made treacherous by recent mountain rains. The current ran swift and dark, with occasional glimpses of white foam where it broke over hidden rocks. The footbridge. Carter panted, pointing toward a narrow wooden structure barely visible in moonlight. But as they approached, lantern light flickered on the far side. More of Thorne's men positioned to cut off exactly this escape route. The sound of pursuing horses grew louder. They were trapped between river and armed men who had demonstrated willingness to use violence against children. That was when salvation appeared in unlikely form. Pete Kowalski's freight wagon came thundering down the river road at reckless pace, his team dancing nervously as he hauled back on reins. The nervous little man looked different now, face bruised and swollen, shirt torn and bloodied left eye completely shut. "Doc Carter," Pete called out, voice tight with pain and anger. "What are you folks doing here?" "Pete, we need help." The freight hauler looked toward approaching lantern lights, then at the small group of refugees. For a moment that stretched like eternity. Tokala thought the man would refuse. It would be the sensible choice. Instead, Pete spat blood into dust and jerked his thumb toward the wagon bed. "Get in. Keep your heads down." They scrambled into the wagon as the first horseman rounded the bend. Pete cracked his whip, and the horses lunged forward with desperate energy. "Hold there." Hawkeye's voice cut through the night. "Sheriff's business." Pete didn't slow down. "Medical emergency for Doc Morrison in Pine Ridge. Can't stop." A rifle cracked and splinters flew from the wagon's side, missing Beatrice's head by inches. Little Nora whimpered in Tokala's arms, and Lillian pressed protectively against her youngest sister. They thundered across the narrow bridge, wooden planks groaning under the weight. Behind them, more shots rang out, bullets whistling through air and striking water with sharp splashes. One bullet punched through the wagon's canvas cover directly above their heads. Another shattered the driver's seat inches from Pete's elbow. But the freight hauler held his course, whipping his team to greater speed as they raced toward the darkness beyond town limits. "Now there." Carter pointed through the night toward distant lights among cottonwood trees. Abigail's place. But even as they raced toward potential safety, Tokala knew their troubles were far from over. The scope of the manhunt resources being deployed against 3 orphaned children, obvious coordination between law enforcement and Thorne's private army, all suggested something far more serious than simple custody disputes. Whatever secrets these girls carried were valuable enough to justify open violence. And men willing to shoot at children in public would not hesitate to pursue them into countryside where bullets could be buried along with their targets. The wagon bounced and rattled through the night, carrying them toward uncertain refuge. Behind them, lights of pursuit followed like hunting wolves' eyes, patient, relentless, utterly without mercy. Abigail Hargrove's homestead sat on a gentle rise overlooking the river valley, its windows glowing warmly against pre-dawn darkness, like lighthouse beacons. She met them at her door before Pete's wagon fully stopped, a tall, formidable woman in her mid-40s with steel-gray hair pulled back severely, and intelligent eyes that cataloged every detail of their desperate arrival. Lillian Beatrice Nora. She embraced each niece in turn, stern exterior cracking to reveal genuine emotion. When Dr. Carter's message reached me, I feared you might not make it safely. Pete climbed stiffly down, wincing as movement aggravated obvious injuries. I'd best head back to town, Doc. They'll wonder where I disappeared to. Carter pressed silver coins into the freight hauler's bruised hand. Thank you, Pete. What you did took real courage. Weren't nothing but decent behavior. Pete muttered, but his face showed quiet pride. Besides, they made it personal when they worked me over. After Pete's wagon disappeared into darkness, Abigail ushered her guests into the main room of her modest but comfortable home. The space served as both kitchen and parlor, with a large stone fireplace and shelves lined with more books than Dakota had ever seen, hundreds of volumes on every conceivable subject. Schoolteacher, Abigail explained, noticing his amazed expression. 37 years of collecting knowledge and trying to pass it on. As Lillian recounted their parents' deaths and harrowing flight from Shadow Lake, Abigail's expression grew increasingly grim. When the story reached their encounter with Hawkeye and discovered corruption, she slammed her fist on the table hard enough to rattle dishes. That corrupt snake, I always knew Roland had flexible morals, but I never imagined this level of depravity. She rose and moved to a cabinet, pulling out a thick folder. I've been documenting Thorne's activities for months, but I needed concrete proof. Lillian looked uncertainly at her sisters, then reached into her canvas bag and produced a carefully wrapped bundle. Father gave these to me the night before he died. He said if anything happened, we should take them to someone we could trust completely. With trembling hands, she unwrapped oilcloth to reveal a ledger page covered in neat columns, along with several official-looking receipts and documents bearing various signatures and territorial seals. Abigail examined the papers with a magnifying glass, lips moving silently as she cross-referenced numbers and dates. After several minutes, she looked up with fire in her eyes. Extraordinary. Systematic proof of wage theft, documentation of falsified water rights, evidence of bribes to county officials. She squinted at one receipt. And this signature, Henry Alton. That's Hawkeye's real name on deliveries of lamp oil to strategic locations. Tokala studied the documents. His reading skills were limited, but he could make out dates and place names. Shadow Creek Trestle, Willow Springs Bridge, the old mill at Cottonwood Flats. He looked up sharply. Key transportation points, places where fires could cut off escape routes or create the appearance of coordinated Indian attacks. Carter added grimly. The implications struck them simultaneously. Thorne wasn't just stealing money and land, he was planning something requiring scapegoats and controlled chaos, something large enough to justify federal intervention. Dawn was breaking when the sound of approaching horses reached them. Through Abigail's windows, they could see riders silhouetted against pink and gold sky, at least 8 men led by Sheriff Mathers on his distinctive white gelding. They found us, Beatrice whispered. But as the riders approached, Tokala noticed something that made his warrior instincts flare with alarm. Behind the main group, partially concealed by morning shadows, rode another figure, someone who had been conspicuously absent from their previous encounters, but whose presence now suggested a betrayal that cut deeper than simple corruption. Dr. Morrison sat his horse with the defeated posture of a man who had sold his soul for pieces of silver. The physician from Pine Ridge, who had seemed so trustworthy during their brief meeting, was pointing directly toward the homestead while speaking urgently to Sheriff Mathers. The traitor Tokala breathed understanding, flooding through him like ice water. Dr. Morrison has been reporting our movements to them. The revelation hit the others like a physical blow. Morrison had been present when they discussed their plans, had known their destination, had even offered medical supplies, all while secretly serving as Thorne's spy within the medical community. Abigail's face went white with fury. That Judas, I trusted him with information about other families Thorne was targeting. There was no time to process the full implications of the betrayal. Sheriff Mathers dismounted with theatrical flourish, his white hat gleaming in morning sunlight and badge prominently displayed. "Abigail," he called across the farmyard. "I'm here on official territorial business. You're harboring fugitives wanted for questioning in connection with attacks on mining property." Abigail stepped onto her porch, double-barreled shotgun cradled but not yet pointed. "These are my nieces Roland. They have every legal right to be here. They're wards of the county now, and they're in possession of stolen property belonging to Shadow Lake mining operations. I've seen your forged papers and they don't impress me." Mathers' face darkened, his hand moving toward his gun. "You're interfering with legal law enforcement, Abigail." But something in his voice caught Tokala's attention, a tremor that spoke not of anger, but of fear. Roland Mathers wasn't just corrupt. He was terrified. And terrified men made desperate choices. That was when Tokala made his decision. While the confrontation continued on the front porch, he slipped out Abigail's back door and began circling toward the horses. If they were going to escape this trap, they needed transportation and a significant distraction. As he worked his way through the shadows, loosening saddle girths and cutting reins with techniques learned during raids against cavalry patrols, he overheard a conversation that changed everything. "Told you to handle this quietly," Dr. Morrison was saying urgently to one of the deputies. "Thorne's getting impatient, and if word reaches the territorial governor about what's really buried under Shadow Lake—" "Shut your mouth," the deputy hissed. "You've said too much already." But Tokala had heard enough. Whatever documents the Hargrove sisters carried, they weren't just evidence of financial crimes. They contained information about something hidden beneath Shadow Lake, something valuable enough to justify systematic murder and the corruption of an entire territorial government. The argument on the porch was escalating toward violence. "Last warning, Abigail," Mathers called out. "Send them out or we'll come in and get them." "You'll have to go through me first." Mathers nodded to Hawkeye, who drew his pistol. "So be it." That was when Tokala whistled a sharp, piercing sound that spooked every horse within 100 yards. The three animals with sabotaged saddles immediately dumped their riders, who hit the ground hard among scattered bridles and stirrups. The remaining horses danced and reared, making coordinated action impossible. In the confusion, Abigail's shotgun boomed once the blast aimed high, but close enough to Mathers' head to singe his hat brim. Men dove for cover, horses scattered, and dust filled the air. "Now," Tokala shouted. The three girls emerged from the house at a dead run, followed by Dr. Carter clutching his medical bag. They had perhaps 30 seconds before the gunmen regained composure. As they mounted pre-positioned horses and spurred toward the river, angry voices shouted orders behind them, and rifle fire split the morning air. A bullet clipped a fence post inches from Beatrice's head, showering her with splinters. But she held her seat and kept riding. They reached the far edge of Abigail's cornfield just as organized pursuit got underway. Through the tall green stalks, they could hear horses crashing through vegetation and men calling directions. But Abigail had planned for this possibility. At the field's far edge, a narrow game trail led down to the river, hidden by overhanging willows and thick underbrush. It was barely wide enough for horses moving single file, but offered concealment the open prairie could not provide. As they followed the winding trail along the riverbank, Tokala reflected on how completely their situation had changed. The corruption was deeper than any of them had imagined, with tentacles reaching into every institution they might have trusted. And somewhere beneath Shadow Lake lay a secret worth killing for a secret that three orphaned girls now carried toward an uncertain fate. The real danger was no longer behind them. It was all around them, woven into the very fabric of territorial society, like a cancer that had metastasized beyond any hope of surgical removal. But they were still alive, still moving, still carrying the evidence that might yet expose the truth. And sometimes, in a land where justice was as rare as water in drought, years that was enough to keep hope flickering like a candle flame in the darkness. For 5 days, they played a deadly game of cat and mouse across the vastness of the Dakota territory. But now the stakes were higher than simple survival. The revelation of Dr. Morrison's betrayal had shattered their trust in potential allies, while the overheard conversation about secrets beneath Shadow Lake had transformed their flight from mere escape to a race against catastrophe. Their first refuge was an abandoned line shack beside what had once been Willow Creek, but drought had reduced the waterway to stagnant pools that bred mosquitoes and despair. The tiny cabin reeked of abandonment, its windows broken and roof sagging, but it offered walls and shelter. They managed perhaps 6 hours of exhausted sleep when approaching horses sent them scrambling for windows. Hawkeye's men had found their tracks despite Tokala's efforts to conceal them, and armed riders were closing from 3 directions. Back window. Tokala whispered urgently. Move quickly but quietly. They escaped through the rear as boots thundered up front steps, leaving behind Dr. Carter's medical bag and most of their remaining food. The loss of medicine was devastating. Little Nora's wolf bite was showing early signs of infection, and without proper treatment, the wound could become life-threatening. Their second night was spent in natural cave formations deep in the Badlands, where wind-carved sandstone created a maze of hiding places. But the cave was also home to rattlesnakes seeking relief from heat, and they spent dark hours listening to scales sliding over stone while trying to keep Nora quiet despite her rising fever. It was there, while Carter cleaned the girl's infected wound with boiled water and precious salt, that Lillian finally revealed the complete truth about what they carried. Father wasn't just documenting financial crimes, she said quietly, her voice barely audible over wind, whistling through stone passages. 3 days before his death, he discovered what Thorne was really after. She pulled out the wrapped documents again, but this time, she separated one particular paper from the rest, a geological survey map that looked different from the others, hand-drawn rather than officially printed. Father found this hidden in Thorne's private safe, she continued. It shows the real reason for all the mining operations, all the land seizures, all the corruption. Carter studied the map by flickering firelight, his expression growing increasingly astonished. Good Lord. This isn't a survey of mineral deposits. It's a diagram of what appears to be an underground oil reservoir. Tokala felt pieces of a vast puzzle clicking into place. Oil. Not gold or silver, but oil. A massive reservoir, according to this map. Carter continued. Stretching from Shadow Lake all the way to the Lakota camps at Cottonwood Flats. If this is accurate, we're sitting on top of one of the largest oil deposits ever discovered in North America. The implications were staggering. Oil was becoming increasingly valuable as industrial development spread across the continent. Railroad companies needed it for locomotives, manufacturers required it for machinery, and the growing cities of the East consumed it in enormous quantities for lighting and heating. That's why Thorne needed to control the land, Lillian said. Not just for mining rights, but for oil extraction rights. He's been systematically driving out anyone with legitimate claims to the territory using his mining operations as cover, while he positioned himself to control the entire oil field. And the planned attack on the railroad trestle, Tokala asked, creates the perfect excuse for federal intervention. Carter said grimly. Martial law means the government can seize whatever land they claim is necessary for public safety. Thorne would get clear title to thousands of acres with official backing for whatever extraction operations he wants to establish. On their third day of flight, they nearly fell into a trap at the Pine Ridge River crossing. But a sudden thunderstorm turned the ford into muddy chaos that allowed them to slip across while guards sheltered under rain slickers. The storm brought its own dangers. Lightning spooked their exhausted horses, and Beatrice was nearly trampled when her mount reared in terror. Lillian pulled her sister to safety, both girls ending up face down in mud, while thunder crashed overhead. But the storm also brought them an unexpected ally. Pete Kowalski found them just after dawn, leading his freight team through muddy ruts left by the downpour. The little man looked considerably worse than their last meeting. Fresh bruises covered his face, left eye completely swollen shut shirt, showing dark stains that could only be dried blood. Thorne's boys paid me another visit, he explained, climbing stiffly down from his wagon seat. Wanted more details about where I'd taken you and what I might have overheard. When I couldn't provide satisfactory answers, he gestured at his battered features. "Pete, I'm deeply sorry," Carter said with genuine regret. "Too late for apologies now, Doc. They made it personal when they threatened my wife and boy." Pete's voice carried a hard edge that hadn't been there before. "But I learned something valuable while they were using my face for target practice." He pulled a crumpled paper from his shirt pocket, a hastily scribbled note that looked like it had been written on official letterhead. "Overheard 2 of Thorne's men discussing their schedule. They're planning something big for tomorrow night, going to burn the railroad trestle over Shadow Creek, then blame the destruction on hostile Indian raids to justify bringing in federal troops." Tokala felt cold dread settle in his stomach. The trestle carries the main rail line serving the territorial capital. Federal cavalry comes in to restore order. Carter finished. And under martial law, Thorne could seize whatever property he wanted without legal challenges. But now they understood the true scope of his ambitions. This wasn't just about land speculation or mining claims. Thorne was positioning himself to control an oil field that could make him one of the wealthiest men in America. And he was willing to start a war to achieve that goal. "We can't let that happen," Lillian said with quiet determination. "Child, we're barely staying ahead of his hunting parties." Pete objected. "What can 4 fugitives do against his entire operation?" "We have proof of his crimes," Lillian replied, clutching the documents. "If we can get these papers to the right authorities before he destroys that trestle." "What authorities?" Beatrice asked with bitter wisdom. "Uncle Roland is corrupt. Half the county officials are on Thorne's payroll, and we can't trust anyone else." That was when Tokala remembered his grandfather's teaching about warfare. Sometimes the most effective attack came from the direction your enemy least expected. "There is another approach," he said thoughtfully. "My people have camps along Cottonwood Flats, and they would be among the first targets if Thorne succeeds in blaming Indian raids." He stood up, decision crystallizing. "If we can warn them about what's coming, and if they understand the true nature of the threat, they'll be prepared to defend themselves." Carter understood immediately. But that could start a genuine war. "The war is already coming," Tokala replied grimly. "The only question is whether my people will face it with knowledge or ignorance." Over the next 2 days, they made their way carefully toward the Lakota encampments, using game trails and creek beds to avoid main roads where Thorne's patrols maintained regular circuits. The documents in Lillian's possession seemed to grow heavier with each mile, carrying not just the weight of paper and ink, but the potential for either justice or catastrophe on a territorial scale. They were within sight of the camp smoke when disaster struck again. It happened at dusk on the 5th day, as they approached the tree line near Cottonwood Flats. Tokala was scouting ahead when he heard the unmistakable sound of many horses approaching at high speed from the south. 8 horsemen burst from concealed positions led by Hawkeye, with his right arm bound in a sling, evidence that Tokala's knife throw had done lasting damage. The man's face was twisted with pain and fury, and the rifle in his good hand was pointed directly at little Nora. "Nobody moves," he shouted, his voice cracking with strain. "I've had enough of this chase." But even as the gunmen closed in, Tokala noticed something that gave him hope. In the distance, barely visible through the trees, cook fires were already burning in the Lakota camp. His people were close enough to hear gunshots, close enough to respond. The confrontation that followed would be remembered in Lakota oral tradition for generations, though white newspapers would never report the full truth of what happened in those cottonwood groves as darkness fell over the Dakota territory. 15 Lakota warriors emerged from the trees, like spirits materializing from shadow and moonlight, their painted ponies moving with silence that came from generations of hunting on open grasslands. They formed a loose semicircle around the standoff, their presence changing the entire dynamic without a single word being spoken. At the center rode Wikasa, an elder whose age showed in silver-streaked hair, but whose bearing remained proud and dignified. He wore traditional regalia of a peace chief eagle feathers arranged in a magnificent headdress beadwork that told stories of his people's journey across the continent and the quiet authority that came from decades of life-and-death decisions. "Tokala," the elder said in Lakota, his voice carrying across the tense silence. "Why do armed Wasiku threaten children near our camp?" Tokala responded in the same language words, flowing with native rhythm and cadence. "These girls carry proof of crimes committed against both our peoples. The men who pursue them seek to blame us for destruction they plan to create themselves." The conversation continued in rapid Lakota, with Tokala explaining the situation, while Hawkeye's men grew increasingly nervous. They were badly outnumbered now, and several warriors carried repeating rifles that were clearly well-maintained and frequently used. "English." Hawkeye snapped, sweat beading on his forehead despite cooling evening air. "I want to understand what you're plotting." Wikasa regarded the gunman with calm assessment usually reserved for dangerous but potentially manageable predators. When he spoke, his English was clear and precise, marked by formal cadence of someone who had learned the language in missionary schools. "There is no plotting required, young man. You are armed intruders threatening children near our camp. The response to such behavior is simple and traditional." The implication hung in the air like smoke from a signal fire. Hawkeye's tactical situation had deteriorated from advantageous to potentially catastrophic. There were lawmen pursuing fugitives, Hawkeye said, though his voice lacked earlier confidence. "These girls are wanted by territorial authorities." "Whose authority?" Wikasa asked mildly. "Your sheriff who takes gold from mining companies. Your judge who signs papers without reading them." That was when little Nora, still burning with fever and exhausted by days of flight, made a decision that surprised everyone present. She slipped down from her horse and walked directly toward the Lakota elder, her small hand reaching into her dress pocket. "Oh, please, sir," she said in her clear child's voice. "I have something that belongs to your people too." From her pocket, she produced the geological survey map, not one of the financial documents, but the hand-drawn diagram showing the underground oil reservoir. She offered it to Wikasa, with the kind of trust that only children possessed. The elder accepted the paper and studied it by torchlight that one of his warriors quickly provided. As he read, his expression grew grave, then angry, then coldly determined. "This map shows our traditional water sources being claimed by the mining company," he said to Tokala in Lakota. "Springs that have belonged to our people since before the Wasiku came to this land." But as he continued studying the diagram, his expression changed to something approaching astonishment. "And it shows something else. Something beneath the earth that the whites value more than gold." He looked up at Hawkeye with eyes that had witnessed the destruction of buffalo herds, the coming of railroads, and gradual erosion of everything his people held sacred. "You serve men who steal water from children and claim ancient lands as their own. There is no honor in such service." Hawkeye's response was to tighten his grip on his rifle and take aim at the approaching warriors. "I don't give a damn about honor or water rights. I've got a job to do." But his men were already backing away, sensing the shift in momentum and unwilling to die for Dietrich Thorne's ambitions. When three of them quietly holstered weapons and began walking toward their horses, Hawkeye found himself effectively alone. "You yellow-bellied cowards," he screamed at his retreating associates. "Thorne will have your hides for this." "The Thorne ain't here," one of the departing gunmen called back. "And I ain't dying for his money." But as the immediate crisis diffused, a new and more complex situation was developing. From the direction of Willow Springs, a dust cloud on the horizon announced the approach of more riders, a larger group moving with the organized precision that suggested official authority rather than hired guns. Wikasa noticed it too, his experienced eyes reading the signs with warrior's instinct. "Federal marshals," he said to Tokala. "Perhaps a dozen men traveling under government orders." The implications were chilling. If federal law enforcement was involved, it meant Thorne's corruption reached beyond territorial boundaries into Washington itself. The planned destruction of the railroad trestle wasn't just a local scheme. It was part of a conspiracy that had official sanction from the highest levels of government. Hawkeye saw the approaching dust cloud, and his confidence returned. "You see that?" he called to the Lakota warriors. "Federal marshals with warrants signed by the territorial governor himself. You can kill me, but you can't kill the United States government." Faced with this new threat, Wikasa made a decision that would echo through history. Instead of retreating to the relative safety of his camp, he chose to stand and fight for justice, not just for his own people, but for the 3 orphaned girls who had trusted him with their evidence. "Then we will face the federal government with truth," he said simply. "And we will see whether American justice serves the people or serves only those with gold to buy it." As the sun set over the Dakota territory and the approaching marshals drew closer, 2 civilizations prepared to collide over questions that would determine the future of an entire region. The Battle of Shadow Creek was less than 24 hours away, and the outcome would decide whether oil barons could use federal authority to steal an entire territory, or whether courage and truth would prove stronger than corruption and greed. The real test was about to begin. The Shadow Creek Railroad trestle stretched across the gorge like a skeletal bridge between past and future, its wooden timbers black against the star-filled sky. 50 feet below water, rushed over granite boulders with a sound like distant thunder, while overhead the structure creaked and swayed in the prairie wind. But tonight the trestle was more than just a bridge. It was the focal point of a conspiracy that reached from the Dakota territory to the halls of power in Washington, where men in expensive suits decided the fate of families they would never meet. Tokala crouched in brush beside the north approach, counting the barrels of lamp oil that Thorne's men had positioned at strategic points along the span. 12 barrels enough to turn the entire structure into a roaring inferno, visible for miles. In the morning, territorial authorities would find charred timbers and conveniently discover evidence of Indian sabotage that would justify whatever military response Thorne desired. But the real shock came when he saw who was directing the operation. Sheriff Roland Mathers moved among the arsonists with the desperate energy of a man who knew his life hung in the balance. But it wasn't greed or ambition driving him. Now it was naked terror. As Tokala watched from concealment, he overheard a conversation that revealed the true depths of Thorne's hold over local officials. "Told you what happens if you fail me," Dietrich Thorne was saying to the sheriff. "Your wife, your 2 daughters, and that boarding school back east accidents happen to families of men who can't follow simple instructions." Mather's voice shook with suppressed fury and fear. "You said this would be simple land speculation. You never mentioned oil reserves worth millions, never said anything about killing children. Children grow up to ask inconvenient questions." Thorne replied coldly. "Better to solve problems before they become bigger problems." The exchange revealed what Tokala had begun to suspect. Roland Mathers wasn't just corrupt, he was being coerced. Thorne had leverage over the sheriff's family, using threats against innocent women to ensure compliance with increasingly horrific demands. From his concealed position, Tokala could also see the federal marshals who had arrived that afternoon, led by a stern-faced man whose badge caught moonlight. Marshal Davidson and his men were positioned around the trestle with the professional competence of seasoned lawmen, but they clearly believed they were there to apprehend dangerous Indian raiders rather than witness the destruction of evidence. At 11:30, a new group of riders approached from the east, and what Dakota saw made his blood run cold with understanding of just how deep the conspiracy reached. Dr. Morrison rode at the head of a small party that included two men in expensive Eastern suits and a figure that Dakota recognized with shock, Territorial Governor Harrison himself supposedly traveling incognito to witness the Indian attack firsthand. The governor's presence meant this wasn't just about oil rights or land speculation. This was about creating a precedent that would allow industrial interests to seize Native American land throughout the West, using fabricated evidence of hostility to justify military intervention wherever valuable resources were discovered. But at 11:45, something happened that no one had anticipated. The distant whistle of an approaching locomotive echoed across the prairie night, clear and unmistakable, despite the mile of track separating train from trestle. The night express from Deadwood was arriving nearly 2 hours early, carrying mail passengers and, most crucially, territorial officials who were returning from meetings in the capital and had no knowledge of the trap waiting ahead. What in blazes? Thorne snarled, checking his pocket watch. That train isn't scheduled until after midnight. Governor Harrison looked equally dismayed. If there are witnesses to what we're doing here, then we handle the witnesses, Thorne replied coldly. Light those fires now before the train reaches the bridge. But Dakota was already moving his war cry, echoing across the night, as 15 Lakota warriors emerged from concealment with fluid coordination. Their first volley of rifle fire shattered oil barrels and sent lamp fuel spilling harmlessly into the creek below. Now what the hell? Hawkeye started to say, then dove for cover as a bullet from Hugh McCrae's rifle whined past his ear. The battle for Shadow Creek had begun, but it was unlike any confrontation the Dakota Territory had ever witnessed. This wasn't just a fight between settlers and Indians, or even between law and crime. It was a collision between two different visions of what America could become. Marshall Davidson found himself caught in the middle of chaos he didn't understand, watching federal authority being used to support what was clearly criminal activity. When Lillian Hargrove emerged from concealment carrying the documents that proved the conspiracy, he faced a choice that would define his career and his conscience. Marshall Davidson. She called over the gunfire. I have evidence of the real conspiracy. The federal lawman looked up from cover, his weathered face showing confusion as he tried to understand what a teenage girl was doing in the middle of a firefight. What evidence? He demanded, his service revolver trained on shadows where muzzle flashes continued to strobe. Lillian thrust the documents toward him with hands that trembled from exhaustion and adrenaline. Proof that Dietrich Thorne and his associates planned this entire attack, financial records showing bribes to territorial officials, the geological survey map showing the oil deposits, documentation of systematic murder and land theft. Davidson took the papers and began reading by locomotive headlight, his expression growing darker with each page. What he found there challenged everything he had been told about the situation and suggested he had been manipulated into providing federal sanction for organized crime on a massive scale. These documents appear authentic, he said slowly, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had spent decades evaluating evidence. If they're genuine, then I've been lied to about this entire operation. That was when Dietrich Thorne made his most desperate and revealing mistake. Drawing his custom rifle, he took careful aim not at the Lakota warriors or ranch hands who were destroying his arson plan, but at Lillian Hargrove, a teenage girl whose only crime was possessing evidence of his corruption. Shoot her, he screamed at his hired gunman. She's got documents that could ruin everything. But Marshall Davidson was a federal lawman first and politician second. The sight of a wealthy mine owner ordering the murder of a child crystallized his understanding of the true situation with brutal clarity. "Nithornhanger," he shouted, swinging his revolver toward the mine owner. "Drop that weapon immediately." Thorne's response was to fire at the federal marshal, his bullet missing Davidson's head by inches. The marshal's return shot was more accurate, catching Thorne in the shoulder and spinning him around so that his expensive rifle clattered across the wooden bridge deck. But even as the immediate threat to Lillian was neutralized, the larger battle continued to rage. Governor Harrison, seeing his carefully planned conspiracy collapsing around him, made a decision that revealed the true extent of federal complicity in the scheme. Marshal Davidson. He called out with all the authority of his office. I'm ordering you to arrest those Indian raiders and anyone helping them, and this is a matter of territorial security. Davidson hesitated, torn between official orders and the evidence of massive corruption now spread before him. In that moment of uncertainty, the approaching locomotive's whistle grew louder and more urgent as the engineer finally realized something was wrong ahead. The train was now close enough that its headlamp illuminated the entire battle scene, revealing the full scope of the confrontation to passengers who were leaning out windows and trying to understand why their peaceful journey had been interrupted by warfare. Among those passengers, Tokala noticed with satisfaction, were several men in expensive suits who could only be federal officials returning from business in the capital. Whatever story eventually emerged from this night's events, it would be witnessed by people whose testimony could not be easily dismissed or suppressed. But the battle was far from over. Sheriff Mathers, caught between his terror of Thorne's threats and his growing realization that the conspiracy was collapsing, found himself in an impossible position. His wife and daughters were still hostages to Thorne's organization. But his participation in mass murder would mean the destruction of everything he had ever claimed to stand for. In that moment of crisis, Roland Mathers made the choice that would define the rest of his life. Instead of following Thorne's orders to eliminate witnesses, he turned his gun on his former employer and fired 3 shots into the air. The traditional signal for ceasefire that any frontier lawman would recognize. "This ends now," he shouted across the battlefield. "I'm still sheriff of this county, and I'm placing Dietrich Thorne under arrest for conspiracy murder and treason against the United States." The declaration sent shockwaves through both sides of the conflict. Thorne's hired gunmen, seeing their employer wounded and their federal backing evaporating, began throwing down their weapons rather than face charges of firing on federal marshals. The Lakota warriors, understanding that their enemy was surrendering, held their fire while maintaining defensive positions. But Governor Harrison wasn't finished. Drawing a hideout pistol from his coat, he took aim at Sheriff Mathers with the cold calculation of a man who had too much to lose to accept defeat. "You're all witnesses to an Indian attack on territorial infrastructure," he called out desperately. "Anyone who says otherwise is lying." That was when Tokala made the decision that would be remembered in both white and Lakota oral traditions for generations to come. Sprinting across the battlefield with the fluid grace that had made him one of the most respected warriors of his generation, he reached the railroad track just as the locomotive began its crossing of the trestle. Without hesitation, he leapt onto the massive machine's cowcatcher and began climbing toward the engineer's cab. "Stop the train," he shouted over the thunder of pistons and driving wheels. "Bridge not safe." The engineer, a grizzled veteran of frontier railroading, took one look at the battle raging around his train and understood immediately. He threw the brake lever into emergency position and opened steam release valves, creating a roaring cloud of white vapor that obscured the battlefield and provided perfect cover for the final phase of the confrontation. In the confusion that followed, with visibility reduced to mere yards and the sound of escaping steam drowning out shouted orders, Governor Harrison made his last desperate play. Using the cover of steam and darkness, he attempted to reach the remaining oil barrels and complete Thorne's arson plan single-handedly. But Wicasa had been watching the territorial governor with the patient attention of a hunter stalking dangerous prey. When Harrison emerged from the steam cloud with a lit torch in his hand, the Lakota elder was waiting for him. "You would burn bridges to hide your crimes," Wicasa said in perfect English, his rifle trained steadily on the governor's chest. "But fire reveals truth as often as it destroys evidence. Harrison's response was to lunge forward with the torch, attempting to reach the nearest oil barrel despite the rifle aimed at his heart. Wikasa's shot took him center mass, and the corrupt governor fell beside the railroad tracks with his torch guttering out in the prairie dust. As the steam cloud gradually dissipated and the locomotive came to a complete stop, just short of the trestle's far end, and the full scope of the night's events became clear to everyone present. Oil barrels lay shattered and empty, their contents harmlessly absorbed by creek water and prairie soil. Armed men sat with hands raised, guarded by an unlikely alliance of Lakota warriors, honest settlers, and federal law enforcement. And in the center of it all, a teenage girl held documents that would reshape the political landscape of the entire territory. Marshal Davidson approached Lillian with a careful respect, due to someone who had just prevented a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. "Miss Hargrove," he said formally, "I believe these documents require immediate examination by federal authorities in Washington." "Yes, sir," Lillian replied, her voice steady despite the exhaustion and terror she had endured. "My father died trying to expose these crimes. I just wanted to make sure his sacrifice meant something." As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, revealing the aftermath of battle scattered across the railroad trestle like debris from a violent storm, then the survivors began to understand the magnitude of what they had accomplished. They had not merely prevented the destruction of a bridge or exposed a local corruption scheme. They had shattered a conspiracy that reached from territorial mining camps to the halls of federal power, revealing how industrial interests were prepared to use fabricated evidence and official authority to steal an entire territory's worth of natural resources. The oil beneath Shadow Lake would still be extracted, but under federal oversight and with revenues shared between legitimate claimants, including the Lakota Nation, whose traditional rights to the land could no longer be ignored or dismissed. Sheriff Roland Mathers, his face wet with tears of relief and shame, approached Marshal Davidson with his hands raised. "I surrender myself for trial, Marshal. But first, I need federal protection for my family. Thorne's organization extends far beyond what we've captured here tonight." Davidson nodded gravely. "That protection is granted, Sheriff, and your cooperation in identifying other members of the conspiracy will be taken into account during sentencing." As the sun rose over the Dakota territory, painting the endless sky in shades of gold and crimson, Tokala allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The immediate crisis had been averted, but the work of building a more just society was just beginning. The wolves had been driven back once more. But eternal vigilance would be required to keep them from returning in new forms, wearing different faces, seeking new ways to prey on the innocent and corrupt at the institutions meant to protect them. Justice had triumphed this time. Whether it would continue to triumph depended on people like these ordinary citizens willing to stand up for truth, even when the cost was nearly everything they held dear. The investigation that followed the Battle of Shadow Creek revealed corruption on a scale that shocked even the most cynical observers of American politics. Within 2 weeks of the confrontation, federal marshals had arrested more than 50 individuals across 3 territories, all connected to what prosecutors described as the most extensive criminal conspiracy in the history of Western territorial development. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Samuel Hargrove's meticulous financial records, combined with the geological survey map and testimony from witnesses who had participated in the night's events, painted a picture of systematic crime that had infected every level of government, from local sheriff's offices to federal territorial appointments. But the most shocking revelation was the scope of the oil discovery beneath Shadow Lake. Federal geological surveys confirmed that the underground reservoir was even larger than Thorne's secret maps had indicated, potentially one of the most valuable oil fields ever discovered in North America, worth tens of millions of dollars at current market prices. The legal battles over extraction rights would continue for years, but the federal courts established several crucial precedents. First, that mineral rights discoveries could not be used to invalidate existing land claims through fabricated emergency powers. Second, that Native American treaty rights to traditional territories remained valid even when valuable resources were discovered beneath them. And third, that revenues from natural resource extraction on disputed lands must be held in federal trust until legitimate ownership could be determined through proper legal channels. Sheriff Roland Mathers, his testimony proving crucial to unraveling the full scope of the conspiracy, received a suspended sentence in exchange for his cooperation with federal investigators. The threats against his family had been real. Federal agents discovered detailed surveillance records and assassination plans that would have been carried out if Thorne's scheme had succeeded. His wife and daughters were safely returned from the East under federal protection, and Mathers was quietly transferred to a position with the Territorial Marshal's Service, where his knowledge of criminal networks proved invaluable. Dr. Morrison, whose betrayal had nearly cost the Hargrove sisters their lives, faced both legal consequences and professional ruin. His medical license was revoked, and he received a 5-year sentence for his role in the conspiracy. But perhaps more devastating was the social ostracism he faced from communities that had once trusted him with their health and safety. Dietrich Thorne himself survived his gunshot wound, only to face a trial that made national headlines. The evidence against him included not just the documents carried by the Hargrove sisters, but also testimony from dozens of minor settlers and territorial officials who had been victims of his systematic campaign of intimidation and fraud. He was sentenced to life imprisonment in a federal penitentiary, his vast mining empire seized by the government, and sold to pay restitution to his victims. But the real victory wasn't happening in courtrooms or government offices. It was happening in the daily lives of ordinary people who could finally live without fear. Dr. Carter's clinic expanded into a proper hospital, treating not only the mercury poisoning that had resulted from Thorne's mining operations, but also addressing the general medical neglect that had plagued the region for years. His partnership with honest physicians created a healthcare network that served both white settlers and Lakota communities, breaking down barriers that had existed since the first wagon trains crossed the prairie. Hugh McCrae's ranch flourished under legal ownership that could no longer be challenged by corrupt officials. His cattle grazed on land that was genuinely his for the first time in years, and he used his newfound prosperity to help other farmers and ranchers reclaim property stolen through Thorne's schemes. Pete Kowalski transformed his freight business from a tool of corruption into a legitimate enterprise serving the territory's growing communities. His routes now carried grain and manufactured goods instead of lamp oil and bribes. His son's lung condition responded well to the clean air that resulted from the closure of illegal mercury processing operations. The Hargrove sisters found not just stability, but purpose under their Aunt Abigail's care. Lillian continued her education with the goal of becoming a teacher, while Beatrice showed remarkable aptitude for the bookkeeping skills that had made their father valuable to honest employers. Little Nora recovered completely from her wolf bite, though she retained a small scar that served as a permanent reminder of the night their ordeal began. Most significantly, the relationship between white settlements and Lakota communities underwent a fundamental transformation. The discovery of the original water rights petition, found buried beneath the school foundation and authenticated by federal archivists, established legal precedent for shared access to the territory's natural resources. Federal Judge Harrison, presiding over the complex legal proceedings that followed the conspiracy's exposure, ruled that the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie remained valid, and that both communities had legitimate claims to the land and water that sustained them. It was a revolutionary decision that challenged basic assumptions underlying territorial expansion, but it was also a practical recognition of reality. Tokala found himself at the center of this transformation, serving as both deputy marshal and unofficial ambassador between cultures that had been enemies for too long. His badge carried genuine authority, now backed by federal law rather than local corruption, and his decisions were respected by both communities because they consistently reflected justice rather than political expedience. The photograph that appeared in newspapers throughout the nation became an iconic image of the new American West Tokala in his traditional Lakota regalia, wearing his deputy marshal badge with quiet pride, standing beside the three Hargrove sisters as they gazed toward a horizon where smoke from Lakota camps mingled peacefully with smoke from settler chimneys. Years later, that photograph would hang in the Smithsonian Institution as a symbol of what was possible. When courage overcame corruption, when cooperation replaced conflict, and when people chose to see shared humanity rather than insurmountable differences. But on this particular morning in late October, as the first winter winds whispered across the prairie grass and the last geese of the season flew south toward warmer lands, the transformation was still new and fragile. Tokala stood beside the restored railroad trestle, watching a passenger train cross safely over Shadow Creek, and reflected on how completely his world had changed. A month ago, he had been a solitary hunter, avoiding contact with white settlements. Now he was a federal lawman responsible for maintaining peace between communities that were learning slowly, and sometimes painfully, to share the same land. A deputy Tokala. He turned to find Lillian Hargrove, approaching, her fair hair catching the afternoon sunlight, and her expression showing the kind of determined curiosity that had served her so well during their shared ordeal. "There's something I wanted to tell you." She continued, her voice carrying a maturity that hadn't been there when they first met beside that wolf-surrounded wagon. "Yesterday, I received a letter from the territorial governor, the new one, not the corrupt man who died at the bridge." She produced an official-looking document from her school bag. "He's offering you a position as special liaison between federal marshals and tribal councils throughout the Dakota Territory. It would mean traveling, establishing formal protocols for cooperation, helping prevent the kind of conflicts that almost destroyed us all." Tokala accepted the letter and read it carefully. His English skills having improved considerably during months of official correspondence. The position being offered would carry significant responsibility and genuine authority, creating a permanent bridge between legal systems that had too often been in conflict. "Would you accept?" Lillian asked. "If they offered you the position." Tokala looked across the prairie toward the distant smoke of the Lakota camps, then back toward the town of Willow Springs, where children of both cultures now attended the same school and learned from teachers who emphasized cooperation rather than conquest. "A man who has seen predators driven back by courage and justice," he said thoughtfully, "has an obligation to help ensure they do not return in new forms." It was the closest thing to acceptance that his careful nature would allow, but Lillian understood the implications. The badge he wore would become more than a symbol. It would become the foundation for a new kind of law enforcement that served all people equally. As the sun set over the Dakota Territory, painting the endless sky in shades that reminded him of his grandfather's teachings about the sacred nature of all creation, Tokala allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The immediate crisis had passed, but the work of building a just society continued. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new conflicts to mediate, new bridges to build between communities still learning to trust each other. The oil beneath Shadow Lake would be extracted eventually, but under federal oversight and with revenues shared among legitimate claimants. The Lakota would not be driven from their traditional lands, and white settlers would not be forced to abandon communities they had built with their own hands. Justice, imperfect but genuine, had found a foothold in this harsh and beautiful territory. The reward for courage, Tokala had learned, was not gold or glory, but something far more valuable. And the knowledge that his actions had helped create a world where children could sleep peacefully, and adults could work honestly, where different cultures could coexist with respect rather than fear, and where the law served justice rather than the highest bidder. In the distance, a real wolf howled, not in hunger or threat, but in simple acknowledgement of the vast prairie night. Tokala heard it and nodded respectfully. There was room in this territory for all creatures, as long as they remembered the ancient laws of balance, respect, and shared responsibility for the land that sustained them all. The fight was over. The healing had begun. And under the eternal stars of the Dakota sky, peace reigned in a place where wolves had once threatened innocent children, but where justice had finally triumphed over greed.